I'm Rob.
And I'm Nate.
And this is Rob and Nate Record a Podcast. This is a different episode. I mean, we will end up talking about movies, but we end up tending to talk about, when we're hanging out and stuff, 9/11 tends to be a relatively common or frequent...
You mostly bring it up.
...topic of conversation. I am fascinated with 9/11 in ways that I can't fully explain. I mean, I guess it would probably be fair to say it was the life-altering event of our generation.
It's weird that the intent is to drop this episode on the 20th anniversary.
Yeah.
And it's just so fascinating to me that, it's such a definitive thing for anybody who was alive at the time. And it's just kind of like backstory to a whole generation of people that were born afterwards or were so young that they simply don't remember it.
Yeah.
And I would have thought if you'd asked me even 6 months ago, this 20th anniversary, would this be a unifying thing for the country? I would have said yes, but I don't think it
Not
is.
until the last couple weeks.
Yeah, with what's happened with Afghanistan, with what's happened with the 9/11 families, asking Joe Biden, the president, not to attend until, the Saudi documents are released. And just the whole way the country is just really the opposite of the way it was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
It's almost it's not impossible to imagine, but it's hard to imagine us coming together again like this. We're just so divided.
Especially for an anniversary, perhaps a little bit further down the road.
Yeah.
I mean, we all kind of thought 20 years down the road, that's going to be so far down the road, it's going to be hard to have anything but those unifying memories. And yet, here we are.
Well, it's 20 years, and we'll just be a couple weeks out of Afghanistan.
Yeah. Yeah, I think part of why I guess I'm asking a question to us. What makes us so special to record our memories on this? And I think we bring a little bit of unique perspective in that we both were in a very unique position on 9/11 when it occurred. We both were serving our missions for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is a different experience to 9/11 than a lot of people had, especially where we were both stateside and had access to a certain amount of media. Though as missionaries, it was very limited media.
I was thinking, with COVID, that's the closest to that kind of experience, only it's spread out longer.
Yeah.
But the 9/11 and the days immediately afterwards, and to a lesser extent the weeks and months that passed, was surreal as a missionary where your media exposure is extremely limited.
Yeah.
It was also extremely violated in the days immediately after 9/11 for reasons that... it's understandable that the leadership would kind of look the other way.
Yeah.
Because how can you not?
Yeah.
Tell our stories?
Yeah. So we were both missionaries in the Tennessee Knoxville mission. We were both assigned to the Tennessee Knoxville mission. I was at the time stationed in Signal Mountain, and you were...
in Maryville.
Oh, you were in... That's right. You would have been...
And so we were both in areas that you would serve with me in Maryville later on, and I had served in Signal Mountain in the past.
Yeah.
And you were serving with Elder Brandt, who I had served with previously.
So I had actually flown home right before 9/11 and came back. Did you recall that?
Yeah, well, because me and Elder Brandt were in Harriman.
Oh, that's right.
And we were looking for a new apartment because we were in what had been a senior couple's apartment, and the lease was about to end. And so when you and the other elder that had to go back... and they had to close an area. It's like, well, we don't really need 2 sets of elders in Harriman, and so we'll just pluck them out. And they sent Elder Brandt down to Signal Mountain. They sent me up to Whitley City, Kentucky for a week until transfers. Then I went down to Maryville where I finished up.
Yeah, in July, I think it was July. Yeah, July 2001. I had to go home for a little while for a medical issue. And returned it was the end of July because I returned in August. Mm. And so I'd been back in the mission 6 weeks on 9/11, but, less than a full transfer. And yeah, so we were both in unique places on 9/11. And I will get to one of the unique memories of having been in Signal Mountain on 9/11, which ties into a movie that is not on our list, but we'll get to that later. Okay. So, yeah. Why don't you go ahead first with your memories? How did you first learn of it that day?
So I was serving in Maryville, and of course it was a Tuesday, and we had service where the missionaries help out at some local something or other, usually twice a week for around 2 hours. And so our service was at the Blount County Food Pantry, which was run by Sister
Reed.
Lola Reed, a convert to the church and a prominent black member.
Yeah.
It's not super common down there. And so at that point, the building that the food pantry was in had been condemned, or they had to move. And so there was what had been a pet store across the street, and so they got the rights to rent that place. And us and the Alcoa elders and various volunteers from the ward and from the city were helping to move canned goods and other things across the street. And so we arrive and we're doing the service, and then Brother Audley Mitchell stops by and comes up to us, "Hey, you elders hear about those planes flying into those buildings?" I'm like, "What are you talking about, Brother Mitchell?" It's like, "Yeah, throwing the Pentagon and the Twin Towers." And I'm like, "That sounds like a Tom Clancy movie." And it's like, well, he seems pretty darn convinced. Elder Webb, we should figure out what's going on. And so in the old food pantry room building, we turned on the stereo, which is technically a no-no, but we were starting to hear things. And so we turned it on, and whatever station the radio had been switched to had switched to CBS's feed because it was Dan Rather.
Everybody switched to something
to some
like
kind
that.
of national. And so Dan Rather's talking. You can kind of hear noise in the background. And he's like, "And we're not sure where the president is at this moment, blah, blah, blah." And then you hear this, kind of stops, this rumble, rumble. "The second tower has collapsed." I turned to Elder Webb, and I'm like, "Second tower's collapsed? That means the first tower's collapsed. What is happening?" And so we did service, finished up service, went back to the apartment. There was a message from the senior couple in the mission office saying,
Telling everyone to report.
"Elders, are you aware of what's going on?" So yeah, we're aware. I can't remember if we talked to them or if it was a message. I think we actually did talk to them.
Okay.
And they basically said...
probably when you called in to report when you got back to your apartment.
Yeah, and they said to basically stay away from federal buildings, which was a little difficult because we were fairly close to a federal building.
Yeah.
The Blount County Courthouse was just kind of across the way there. And to basically try to operate kind of normalish. And we had an appointment, and then I had to convince Elder Bryce to let me turn on the radio while we waited for the appointment. And then we went into the appointment. We didn't teach. We just watched the news with the lady. And then it was just a surreal, especially the days after and the weeks after. And the churches were open at night for prayer, and they closed them all in Maryville because everybody was just paranoid. I think this is probably true across the country. People are convinced that my area is important. They're going to get my area.
Yeah.
And in Tennessee, there was the nuclear facilities at Oak Ridge, and a lot of locals were like, "Well, that's an obvious target."
There was also the reactor in Saudi Daisy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you remember the lines for gas? This
Yes, I do.
anticipatory thing?
Yeah, so I was in Signal Mountain, and I do remember having thoughts that morning about how just distinctly beautiful a day it was. Signal Mountain, as anyone who's familiar with the area is elevated above the Chattanooga Valley. And so if you drive anywhere near the edge of Signal Mountain, you have this just great view. And I do remember thinking to myself just how beautiful the sky was that morning. And we were working on what was called a lost sheep file. The church, back then, if someone moved out of your congregation, you could forward the records back to Salt Lake to headquarters. And they had a repository of people in Salt Lake that they had no clue where they were. And the church knew this was a bad thing, so they decided a different approach to trying to find these people. They called them lost sheep files. They sent them back to the missionaries in the last known area so they could go to the addresses and have an excuse to talk to people and try and track them down and forward the things. I don't know how many people were actually ever found via that method. I think we found forwarding addresses for 2 people. But it gave you a better excuse than just a general knock on the door to meet people. And so we were working on this file, and we went out. We were a ways out of Signal Mountain, and it was one of those things where...
We're on your way to Dunlap?
Yeah, it was... I forget the name of the... It was more than halfway to Dunlap.
All right.
Which is actually so far out of our area, it's in a different time zone.
Yeah.
It crossed over into Central Time Zone. And we were across the timeline, but we weren't in Dunlap yet.
Yeah.
But it was far enough away, miles... Missionaries, if they have a car, their mileage is severely limited. I think it was 45 miles a day or something like that is all you had. So something like going this far out in our area, you know, you burned at least 2 days worth of mileage, if not more. And so, like, you needed to make good use of your time. So we planned an entire day out in this region. And I think it was the second or third door we knocked on. This guy who, I've kind of joked that he was like the picture book definition of a redneck. No shirt on, overalls with holes that were placed such that you could tell he was not wearing any underwear. Only a couple teeth in his mouth, you know, bandana, big beard. Comes out and, you know, meets us out in the driveway, and he asks us what we thought of all the planes crashing and bombs going off. And I had been in a doctor's office. I had a surgery in October 2000 on the mission, and so I was in the doctor's office when the USS Cole happened. So I was more aware of those types of things than the average missionary, and I was quite aware of the USS Cole. And so I assumed it was something like that. And then he said something about the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, and just kind of got an odd feeling.
Yeah.
And this guy was pretty crazy, kind of out there. And so Elder Brandt and I were just trying to get away from him. And so, like, we left and went back to our car just to have an excuse that not to have to continue to talk to this guy. And we got in the car and we were starting to drive away from this guy. And both just kind of looked at each other and said, I think we should go back to town. Which was very odd, because if you've committed the mileage to go out somewhere that far, you don't just turn around and go back. So we decided to go back to town, and as we were driving into town into Signal Mountain, there's that one grocery store there and the one gas station, which now there's more. But there was a line, you know, down past the grocery store for the gas station. Like blocks past the grocery store. We'd never seen anything like that, and when we drove, you know, we just drove past the line because we didn't know what was going on. And when we drove past the gas station, there was a police officer in the parking lot directing traffic at the pumps. And we thought, what in the world is going on? And at the time, we had what would later be termed an internal investigator family, that the husband was a police officer in the city. So we drove over to their house, and we walked into their house as the second tower collapsed, which seems to be a common thread. Everyone kind of seems to have, or a lot of people seem to have become aware of it just in time to have seen the second tower collapse. But we walked in just as the second tower collapsed, and it was the Roach family. That's whose house we went to, and we said something to her about the tower collapsing, and she goes, "Yeah, we already saw that. It's just a replay." We're like, "No, it's live. It just fell. There's no towers left." And she goes, "Wait, the second tower fell?" You know, and came out, and I remember her breaking down in tears. And this was the first time that it really struck me how the scope of this. Like, you hear about people breaking down in tears when they heard about, like, JFK being shot and things like that. And I'd never actually seen a moment in history where something like that happened. And so as soon as she broke down in tears, it instantly sunk in my brain. It was like, oh, this is really big.
Yeah.
And we kind of stood there transfixed for quite a while. I don't really know how long we stood there, but it was quite a while. And after we'd been there probably a couple of hours, it occurred to me, oh, hey, maybe we should check our messages. And so I used their phone and called our apartment and checked the answering machine, and there was a message from the mission office saying all missionaries needed to report back to their apartments. You know, go straight to your apartment and check in once you're at your apartments. And what I recall is that we were told to stay at our apartments until all missionaries had checked in. And so we were at the apartment for several more hours, and then we got a call back saying that we could resume proselyting, but with the various restrictions. We also had issues avoiding federal buildings. My recollection is that we were told to stay a specific distance away from them, which for you would have been more difficult because, like you mentioned with the courthouse, like, if my recollection is correct, we were told to, like, stay a quarter or half a mile away from federal buildings.
We were probably about a quarter mile from it. Yeah.
Probably within that circle in Maryville, but so we also had issues avoiding the federal buildings. And
I can't remember. I wonder if me and Elder Bryce, who was serving with at the time, because I don't recall being told to stay put. But I think maybe we told them that we had an appointment, and I think they probably said you can go to your appointment.
Yeah.
And then it's a little bit fuzzy after that about what, you know, the rest of the day. I think we had. I can't.
We kind of sat around and listened to the radio a lot that day. And
yeah, we went to Joe. We went to Joe, and we watched TV with the news there, and then the days that followed, and then a couple days later they had us do the knock on doors and just ask people to pray.
Day of prayer in the morning. You know, the other thing that sticks out in my memory of 9/11 is Chattanooga has an airport. It's generally a cargo airport, but they were landing planes everywhere that day. And so there's two distinct memories about that day. When we finally left the apartment, we had noticed the increase in airplane traffic over the mountain. And so we drove out to the edge of Signal Mountain where we could see down into the airport area. And the Blue Angels were in Chattanooga that week because I remember watching from the edge of the mountain. We would routinely drive out to that road that went along the edge of the mountain and kind of watch things. And I remember watching the Blue Angels rehearsing. And I remember we drove out to the edge of the mountain. We were watching all these planes come into Chattanooga, wondering what all these people were going to do in Chattanooga without rental cars and all that type of stuff. And all of a sudden there was suddenly a break in the plane traffic, and all of a sudden the Blue Angels just shot off the tarmac, and they were out of sight in seconds. And then the airplanes just continued landing at Chattanooga. The other thing that stands out in the fairly short aftermath afterwards, it was because there was a nuclear power plant nearby that you could actually see from the mountain. Yeah. We saw fighter jets flying over the mountain regularly for weeks and weeks and weeks.
So Maryville, as you know, is where in the Maryville area is where the Knoxville Airport is.
Yes.
And
Tyson McGee Airport.
That 3, 4, 5 days, however long, and we were used to constant air traffic because we were so close to the airport, and it just was weird to notice like there's nothing.
Yeah.
And what was the name of the guy that flew fuel runs for the Air Force?
I don't remember his name, and we had kind of a rotation of a bunch of people that came through while we were there that were coming through the air refueling wing.
But he used to be, we'd go and visit. It's like, yeah, I flew halfway to Spain today.
Yeah.
So it was just my Tuesday.
Yeah.
And
well, for those of you who are unfamiliar, the Tyson McGee Airport, the Knoxville Airport, is a split airport. It's half civilian and half military. And an air refueling wing operates out of that airport.
And it makes sense because they talk about the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, which is the population base, like the central national park. It's within about a day's drive of half of the population of the country. So it makes sense that that would be a place to have your refueling planes in that general area because it's so close to so much of the country and the wider
Well, and in
world.
the months that came, we talked to numerous people that came through the air refueling wing that talked about how, like, their work week was they got on the plane and they flew basically Knoxville halfway to Europe and turned around and came back and then just did that a couple times and then their work week was over.
So this was September. I came back from my mission in January. And it was such a, the pre-mission world and the post-mission world. My parents at the gate to see me go. And then you have to go through security to see your parent. It's like that world that the whole generation had grown up not knowing going to the gate. Just like I never knew smoking on airplanes.
Yeah.
It just changed. And I remember flying home and we flew through, I think, Chicago and seeing heavily armed soldiers in the airports.
Well, do you remember, were you there when we had to go pick someone up at the Knoxville airport? That other missionary that went home? He was in Pigeon Forge. Oh no, it was after you went home. There was an elder in Pigeon Forge whose mother passed away.
Oh.
And so he had to fly home, and they understandably made urgent arrangements to get him on, to a plane. Yeah. And so we had to meet him and his companion at the airport. It was a really super awkward time, and we met them at the airport with their vehicle. And Elder Barry was to get in the vehicle with the other elder and accompany him back to our apartment, and I was supposed to drive back by myself, but we had to pull into the parking garage to meet them. And we had to have our vehicle searched by armed security with M16s to even enter the parking garage to meet them and then turn around and leave. Like you said, it was very different. And it was, and being in that close to a military airport, we saw a lot of fighter jets coming into the airport. They would come in and fly into Knoxville. The air refueling tanker would take off, and then a couple hours later, the fighter jets would take off. So we had numerous times where it just so happened we were near the airport when fighters were taking off, and we just park and watch the fighter jets take off. Very different.
Speaking of very different, let's talk about very the same and go back to talking about movies. Unless you have something else you wanted to throw.
Unless you wanted to mention the National Day of Prayer and Mourning anymore.
Oh, we could talk about that briefly. So
that was a unique time. Like, that was kind of a cool time to be a missionary.
Yeah. Well, there's kind of two parts to that. There's the going around and praying with people, which is cool. And then there was the service at the National Cathedral that they were going to broadcast. And we went to the chapel in Maryville with the other elders, and we could not get the dang thing to do the satellite feed. So I didn't... I think I saw it later. I think I saw it after the mission on video someplace.
I remember going and watching a service at the Signal Mountain Chapel, and we opened up the building, and I forget how we advertised, but we made it known that there was a service, and we had probably 20 or 25 people there to watch the service, and only 2 people were members of the church that weren't the missionaries.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Tell me that.
Yeah. And then the rest of that day was the National Day of Prayer and Mourning, which anyone who had served in Signal Mountain around that time knows that you didn't have a lot of success knocking on doors, but that day, every door we knocked on let us in. So, back to movies.
Back to movies. So I put together a list taken from 2 different lists of movies related to 9/11 or inspired by 9/11, and I just put an alphabetical list through of things that I'd seen. I think you looked at it. You said that you had one that's not on the list. And I also have another one that's not on the list that I forgot to add. So we can talk about those.
I think I'm going to do mine first because it'll tie in to the mission experience, actually.
Okay.
Are you familiar with the documentary The Paperclips Project?
A little bit. I've not seen it.
So this school in
Dunlap.
Rural Tennessee, it wasn't in Dunlap. It was like White City. It's somewhere out there. When they were talking about the Holocaust, the students were having trouble picturing, the numbers that they were talking about. So they wanted to get something to represent the people killed in the Holocaust. And so they proposed collecting paper clips. And the original objective was 1 paper clip for like every 100 people, because the teachers wanted something that was attainable and manageable on scale. Somehow word got out that they were doing this, and people just started donating tremendous amounts of paper clips. And eventually they collected 1 paper clip for every person killed in the Holocaust. So they were trying to figure out how to make a meaningful long-term lesson out of this, and they decided to make some sort of memorial where they would house the paper clips. And they were actually eventually donated a train car from Germany that was used to haul people to the concentration camps and to the death camps and things like that. The train was being transported to rural Tennessee on 9/11 and stopped. All of the trains ground to a halt. And the train was in Signal Mountain on 9/11.
Wow.
And I remember driving by this train and wondering why this train car was on another train car and stopped. I remembered seeing it and never made the connection until years later when I saw the documentary. They eventually got it out to the school. They put tracks in outside the school and just parked the train car there and then filled it with the paper clips. And now it's a field trip, like a regional field trip. People will come down, and the actual students at the school take them on tours of this train car filled with the paper clips that represent the dead from the Holocaust.
So it's still in Tennessee?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
And, I was thinking, paperclip is kind of an ironic choice as representation, because Operation Paperclip was the American operation to get the German Nazi scientists out of Germany and away from the Soviets so that we could use those Nazis for our purposes.
Kind of on a slight tangent, and my wife and I, after having seen the Paperclip Project, we were kind of inspired. And when my wife became a teacher, she is a history teacher in the middle school level. How do you start teaching kids who have no living memory and now weren't even born on 9/11 about things that happened on 9/11? So we created our own version of the Paperclip Project, and she has a jar in her classroom that has a paperclip for everyone killed on 9/11. And we used different colors of paper clips to represent things like police officers, firefighters, EMS, things of that nature. So, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then in non-law enforcement, it's just regular paper clips, non-other categories. So, yeah.
So the first film that I found in this list inspires other kind of associated ones, because it's not really a 9/11 film, but it's a film whose visual motif and certain elements of how it's supposed to make you feel are inspired by 9/11, and that is Cloverfield. Have you seen Cloverfield?
I have not.
You've seen Cloverfield Lane because we saw that together.
Yes.
But the original Cloverfield is early J.J. Abrams. It's about a monster that attacks New York City. And so obviously the damage, and it's done in kind of a mockumentary found footage style where somebody's videotaping this. And so it evokes 9/11, the destruction in New York City. There's a scene where all these people are fleeing across the Brooklyn Bridge and they see the monster. And that reminded me that there was a bunch of films that kind of took in that aesthetic or that sense of dread, one of which is Signs.
Yeah.
Which is a movie I quite liked when I watched it originally in the first few times, but in subsequent viewings, and I think it's probably been 8 or 9 years since I've seen this, is a film that basically runs entirely on a sense of kind of dread. Like, there's a lot of silliness to it and a lot that doesn't really hold up, but it's a mood, the mood of the thing, which is like the 9/11 mood. Everybody's what's happening. Our sense of the world has come apart. And the other film that very much evoked that was the 2005 Steven Spielberg War of the Worlds remake, which very overtly, I mean, Dakota Fanning is it the terrorists attacking as the aliens come out. So this whole kind of sense of 9/11 dread made its way into horror and science fiction films, like the Red Menace made its way into horror and science fiction films back in the 50s. And you don't so much see that now, or at least it doesn't feel as overt in more contemporary films. I guess a little bit the original Avengers from 2012 with its attack on New York has some 9/11 vibes to it. DC 9/11, Time of Crisis from 2003. We watched this for movie night prior to recording. This is a film that was made for Showtime. The writer-producer was a conservative, and this is a hagiography of George W. Bush and the cabinet, where Donald Rumsfeld seems like an absolute super genius, and Bush seems like the greatest guy ever, and Dick Cheney's his number two, and vice. And it's got Timothy Bottoms plays George W. Bush, who played George W. Bush on the Bush-bashing sitcom That's My Bush from Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the South Park guys.
Wow.
Which ran for it just barely got off the air just before 9/11. It was a satire of the first pre-9/11 Bush administration. He's playing a goofy version of George W. Bush. He plays a heroic version of him here.
Yeah.
This film is just fascinating as an artifact because it's just such propaganda. And every Republican is super competent and smart and good. And Tom Daschle's kind of a little weasel. He might not want to be all on board with things. They have to convince him.
Yeah.
So, interesting as an artifact.
Yeah. The next one was Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, which is not entirely about 9/11, but it starts with the events of 9/11 and a son with Asperger's whose father is in the towers for a meeting and is ultimately killed in the adventures he goes on trying to come to grips with things that have happened. So, yeah.
You can see our episode on that film, full 30 minutes or so, talking about it.
Yeah, on YouTube or on other podcasting platforms. Yeah.
Fahrenheit 9/11, 2004, the most money-making documentary ever made. Michael Moore's Screed, about 9/11 and overreactions and the incompetence of the Bush administration. I did see this film theatrically. Have you even seen this film at all? No.
No. I mean, I've seen some of the clips, but I have not seen it.
It's another artifact. It's something that's very much of its time, and this was probably the height of Michael Moore, right around this period.
Well, and I've never been a huge Michael Moore fan because of the various things. But
Michael Moore is a talented filmmaker and a problematic polemicist. He's hit and miss, often within the course of the same film. One thing that really worked in this film is the opening segments are just a blank screen, seeing this in a theater, and it's just audio of 9/11, and then it gets on to his various political points. I think I watched it the last time, probably 6 or 7 years ago. I recommend it principally just for its historical significance, and he has good points mixed in with the weaker points through it.
The next one is the 2018 series that is on Hulu called The Looming Tower.
which you had me see. We did
Which
that.
it was quite a well done production. It does a good job of putting things in context leading up to 9/11 and how the history of these events contributed to 9/11 and things of that nature, and concludes on 9/11 with a former FBI guy who's now director of security at the Twin Towers.
Yeah, this is that story that I think most of us had heard.
Yeah.
About there was an FBI guy who just took over security at Twin Towers that Monday.
Yeah.
His second day on the job, and I was vaguely aware of who this person was, but I was not aware of the backstory. Quite the fascinating backstory that takes us back through the 90s, through early concerns about Osama bin Laden and the interagency fights that kind of crippled us. That allowed that if we hadn't been fighting each other the way we were, we might have been able to catch this thing before it happened.
Yeah.
And Jeff Daniels is really good.
And it does a good job of introducing people to Ali Soufan, who is an actual FBI agent, who was a Muslim, who became quite prominent after 9/11 and things of that nature. So.
And Jeff Daniels, what was the name of the guy he played?
John O'Neill.
He's a bit of a character.
Yeah.
He was having multiple romantic entanglements at the same time. He was spearheading the defense of the country against bin Laden.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good series. If you have access to Hulu and you haven't seen it, I think we both strongly
better than I thought
it
would be. More gripping than I thought it would be.
Did we record about that, or did we just
No,
watch
that was
it?
That was before we started recording.
Yeah. The next one, also one that I was the instigator of watching, is the 2007 film Reign Over Me. Again, tangentially 9/11.
We've also done an episode about this.
Yeah, Adam Sandler. It's a multiple movie episode, but Adam Sandler, his family was killed on one of the planes that crashed into the towers, and just the grief that he experiences afterwards reconnects with someone he knew pre-9/11, actually before he met his wife and had his family, and how he resumes a friendship there, and just things that go on with his wife's family, things of that nature. Again, tangentially 9/11. I think that movie kind of won you over.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. So you had been kind of encouraging me to see this for years, and I was kind of like, Adam Sandler as a 9/11 widower. I don't think so. And then I watched it, I'm like, yeah, it's got some issues, but yeah. And now as I think about it, a year and a half, 2 years after I saw it, I'm like, I think I'm back in the Adam Sandler as a 9/11 widower.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. I'm a fan of that movie. It worked for me. So.
United 93 from 2006. It's the film about United 93, the plane that didn't hit its intended target because the passengers led a revolt, crashing the plane into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania.
Who crashed the plane, but it was as a result of
the insurrection on the plane. Yep.
Storming the cabin. Interestingly enough, I was recently reminded through a podcast I'm listening to, while they have the cockpit voice recorder from the crash, it's never been released. They've only ever released partial transcripts.
Interesting.
So it's evidently because it was so traumatic and lots of screaming and
Okay, yeah.
So it's not clear whether the passengers crashed the plane or whether the terrorists, in response to the passengers breaking into the cabin, crashed the plane. So.
It's a film I saw theatrically. It is an R-rated film.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Huh.
I wasn't watching it. I was just beginning to watch really R-rated films probably around this time. It is, I'm blanking the name of the guy who directed it, British guy, Greengrass. Paul Greengrass.
Yeah.
Who's also known for the Bourne Identity movies and Captain Phillips.
Yeah.
This film is, like, when I wrote my blog review for it, I think I basically said, there are some movies that just everything's on the screen. There's really nothing more to say. There's not a lot to analyze. It's very straightforward. There's no big stars in the film. I think I recognize David Rashi as one of the passengers, but it's just these normal people caught in this extraordinary circumstance. I don't know if I think I saw the film once after I saw it in the theater. I should probably revisit it, but I remember it being very kinetic, very powerful, and kind of understated. And it is one that I should revisit probably in the coming weeks.
Yeah. Vice from 2018.
We can kind of clump these two together, which is Vice from 2018 and W from 2008.
Yeah.
One about Dick Cheney, one about George W. Bush, and you can't tell those stories without talking about 9/11.
Yeah. Yeah, it totally reshaped that entire administration, and yeah.
Vice has, ironically, kind of more of a biting edge to it than W, even though W is an Oliver Stone film.
Uh-huh.
And Oliver Stone, we all know his politics. I honestly would have thought that George W. Bush would come across looking worse in an Oliver Stone directed film, but as Gore Vidal said of Woodrow Wilson, who he hated, and who came across well in a book that he wrote, it's like, if you're sincere, you look good. And I think George W. Bush was damn naive, but sincere.
Yeah.
Those are both interesting movies. I would recommend both movies.
Yeah. For different reasons somewhat, but at the same time the same movie, or same reasons. From 2006, World Trade Center.
Another Oliver Stone.
I have mixed feelings about that movie.
That's another one that you'd think would go in a much more political direction than it did, where it's mostly this story of those 2 or 3 people that survived after the collapse in like a sub-basement or something. Firemen and a couple other people. Nick Cage is in it.
Emergency service units, police officers, but yeah. It seems like it would be hard to make a movie about people surviving the World Trade Center and not have it be compelling.
Yeah.
And while this movie is kind of compelling, it's also kind of overplayed. So
kind of the foreshadowing thing is there's that guy that helps dig him out, and he was a veteran. He traveled from someplace in the South, I think, to help dig them out.
Uh-huh.
And I think at the end he's talking about how he's going to re-enlist, and he's kind of symbolic of American rage about what happened and the wars that would follow. So that's a very kind of a Stone touch to be in there. But, you know, this is a 2006 release. This is 5 years
It was
later.
too soon.
And so these early films about it are still kind of in shock about it in a way.
Yeah.
You know, that it's more sacred territory than it would be if you were to make a film about that now. It'd be more morally gray. And at this point, even Oliver Stone was tepid on the amount of moral grayness he was willing to introduce into this story.
Even flashing forward 6 years from that to around the 10-year anniversary, a little past the 10-year anniversary of 9/11, is the 2012 release Zero Dark 30, in which you're still a little bit tepid about the morals of it. Again, this was in closer proximity to the actual mission to capture or kill Osama bin Laden. In this film, obviously...
Just the previous year. I mean, this film had a tremendously quick turnaround time. We also did a complete episode about this film.
But again, like, as we talked about in our episode about this, the character who's known as Maya in Zero Dark 30 and portrayed by Jessica Chastain, when you actually learn a little bit about her, is a very morally ambiguous person in the history of 9/11. Is featured both in The Report and The Looming Tower, or is portrayed in both of those films because of her connections to things like Alex Station and other issues with the problems between the CIA and FBI. So, yeah.
I would also recommend, if you are interested in 9/11 film, there is a 2-part YouTube video essay from the video essayist Lindsay Ellis, where she talks about 9/11 depictions in media. That's pretty darn gripping. I think I showed at least part of that to you.
Yeah.
Some years back. Obviously, the definitive 9/11 film has not been made. I think we're going to need more distance before we get something that doesn't have that feeling of still being unwashed with emotion, something that has more distance. And I'm glad that there were films made closer to it to kind of reflect that. But I don't think, you know, you're never going to have anything truly definitive on film other than the film of it happening. But I think that the great 9/11 movie has yet to be made, and it may very well be a miniseries, and probably the closest we've had to it is probably The Looming Tower.
Yeah. Or simply just the TV footage that you can find on YouTube.
Yeah. That'll always be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was trying to decide if I was going to turn that on 9/11 this year or not. I probably will rewatch The Looming Tower here in the next week or so. A couple other things that I wanted to mention related to this. One is a book that I'm currently reading. It's called 102 Minutes, and it's accounts of people who were in the towers when the planes were struck. Some of them were on floors that the planes passed through and were later able to escape. It's very interesting. It's taken me a while to read because it's fascinating, but you read a chapter of this and you need a break. You know, the death that they saw, the people that were trapped higher up. This even includes a lot of accounts from people that were trapped higher up and making phone calls and things of that nature. And I would recommend it to people who are interested in 9/11 stuff, but it's a difficult read. So a couple podcasts that I wanted to mention that deal with 9/11. One that came out last year is called Blind Spot, The Road to 9/11. I think you would really enjoy that podcast and their approach to it. And it's dealing with investigations that were underway domestically into terrorism plots that ended up being tied to 9/11, things of that nature. It really was quite good, and I highly recommend that podcast. One that's currently coming out is called Long Shadow, and it's asking questions about unanswered questions from 9/11. One of the more recent episodes was who actually gave the authorization to shoot down Flight 93, which is there's multiple stories about that. There's still unresolved questions surrounding that.
Probably always will be.
Yeah, probably always will be, like you said. I'm interested to see the episodes they've got coming out in the next couple weeks. But yeah, as the name implies, they're dealing with the long shadow that 9/11 has cast ever since. And the last one I wanted to mention is Missing on 9/11, which is about Sneha Phillip, who went missing on 9/11. Last seen on September 10th on video surveillance, and has never been seen or heard from since.
Yeah.
And it's an investigation into what happened to Sneha Phillip.
I was vaguely aware of this because one of the last episodes of Unsolved Mysteries back in 2002 had to do with this.
Yeah, and they talk about in the podcast how that Unsolved Mystery stuff came to be and how they ended up contributing to that. And yeah, so it's another one that's 9/11 related that is narrow focused.
Mm.
Part of the reason that the definitive 9/11 movie has yet to be made and it's difficult to make is it's impacted so many people. How do you focus? What stories do you choose to tell and which stories do you ignore? There's just so many stories out there.
Yeah.
And because this is an event that changed not just America, not just people in New York, but changed the world, everyone has their 9/11 experience. Everyone who was alive at that time.
Yeah. 9/11, heavy stuff.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? As
Well,
we come to the 20th anniversary.
We come to the 20th anniversary. As I said, it's sad that as horrible as that experience was, the unity, I think, is probably something we'll never see again. It's kind of a unique Pearl Harbor-like sense of national unity.
One of the happy stories I tell about 9/11 was that Friday afterwards, that National Day of Prayer and Mourning. Like I mentioned already, anyone who knows Signal Mountain, it was hard for missionaries to knock on a door and get people to let them into their homes. But my companion and I, Elder Brandt, and we left our apartment at 9:30 that day and didn't come home until 9:30. We were out for 12 hours.
Wow.
And every door we knocked on, people let us into their home to pray with them. And that's all we were told to do as missionaries that entire day, was just knock on people's doors and offer to pray with them. And that's all we did all day. So, I mean, other than the broadcast, but yeah. So, it was, that was a unique thing, and it was interesting to be able to bring comfort to people in that time, in that way.
Yeah.
So, likely never have an opportunity to do something like that ever again. So, yeah.
Well.
Yep. Well, I'm Rob.
And I'm Nate.
And this was Rob Nate Record Podcast.